Okay, so all I'm going to do on this next conversation is introduce the leader of it, who I've already spoken about. Mary McCord is a friend, and she, but more importantly, is a really important innovator and leader in this work that we are about here today. She was a senior national security prosecutor in the Department of Justice before helping to found the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center, which we're going to hear more about, as I've said, the work that they're doing tomorrow, and there's more introductions coming of Mary. She'll introduce the folks that we have here. I just wanted to say a quick word about what we're doing here. We had all of this in the works, planning it for a year with all the stakeholders, all the organizations, a lot of the institutions, and the raw talent that you've heard about before Pittsburgh happened. Pittsburgh and the events that happened the prior week in Kentucky and in Florida, with the horrific murder of 2 African Americans by an alleged racist and white supremacist, and the intentional plotting of political assassinations through the U.S. mail in Florida. These all came a couple weeks before a major election, and they all seemed to be the poisonous fruit of a lot of what we're talking about here today. So we made the decision, on top of a lot of the other very rich programming that we're going to have, we were like, we got to do something on counterterrorism. There was that, we have the right people to do it, and we wanted to lead this weekend with it. It is set up as a conversation, not as a panel, so we want to make it accessible to you. We know that it's the opening night. We hope that everybody here continues to socialize and talk. It is a very serious topic, but we thought it only appropriate and necessary to begin with this topic, given what we've seen in the intensification of the stakes of extremism recently. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Mary McCord and to her team here. Take it away, Mary. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. And I was very privileged this spring when Mike called me and asked if I would be a part of this project, because not only did it allow me to continue to play it forward with the work we did in Charlottesville, the case that Mike mentioned that I'm going to talk more about tomorrow morning, but it also allowed me to draw on my history as the acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at Department of Justice, where we addressed terrorism, both international terrorism and domestic terrorism. And this project, I think, is really important to show the relationship between extremism in America, and that is across the spectrum of varieties of extremism, whether it's motivated by jihad or Islamist extremism, as many of our international terrorism cases brought by the Department of Justice when I was there were, or whether it's motivated by white supremacy or anti-otherism. All of these are forms of extremism that at their very worst sometimes result in terrorism. So I'm privileged this evening to be joined by, to my left, William Daroff. William is the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and the Director of the Washington Office of the Jewish Federations of North America. Next to him is Tom Brzezowski, who I'm very pleased to introduce to you. He is the Counsel for Domestic Terrorism at the Department of Justice in the National Security Division, and actually I was part of the hiring decision to bring Tom over to start this position. I think many people here, we can get into this later, thinks of DOJ as focusing on international terrorism and not on domestic terrorism. And bringing Tom into the National Security Division was part of an effort to put more emphasis on domestic terrorism. And so I'm very thankful that Tom could join us today. And then finally, furthest to the left is Oren Segal, who is the director for the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League. And Oren, amazingly, was scheduled to be one of our expert witnesses in the trial in Charlottesville, which ended up resolving without a trial when all of the defendants entered in consent decrees. So very grateful for him joining us tonight, and he's just a wealth of information on what's happening in terms of extremism in America. But I want to start a little bit with definitions. You know, Mike talked about let's create some sort of working definition of extremism, and that included political thought, and it included potential acts of violence motivated by an intent to intimidate or coerce. And I agree with that definition. And I think it's important for us to talk in light of the events that Mike just referenced, the Pittsburgh shooting, the shooting in Kentucky, the shooting at the yoga center, as well as previous acts of terrorism that we've seen over the last several years that Oren will talk more about. I think it's important to talk about what happens when that political thought does cross that line and become a radicalization to violence. And when that happens, that's terrorism. And for purposes of the US sort of criminal code, there's a distinction between international terrorism and domestic terrorism. But there is no such thing as a federal crime of domestic terrorism. But there is a definition. And the definition is a crime dangerous to human life that is intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or that is intended to influence government policy by intimidation or coercion. So when we look at these crimes that we were just mentioned, the most recent crimes, including the very violent and lethal shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, that certainly seems to fit that bill. I've also seen definitions that it is a violence or a threat of violence by non-state actors for political, economic, religious, or social goals through, again, intimidation or coercion. So here's the key: intimidation or coercion and acts of violence. In terms of the difference between that and international terrorism, for purposes of, again, the US criminal code, acts of international terrorism have the same definition, but they are usually done in furtherance of the goals of a foreign terrorist organization, such as ISIS, such as Al-Qaeda. And for that reason, they transcend national boundaries. Now, the crime might be committed here in the United States domestically, but if it's motivated by foreign support for a foreign terrorist organization, our government calls it international terrorism, even if it happens right here in the US soil. If the crime happens here on US soil, but it's a crime of terrorism intended to intimidate, coerce, but not on behalf of a foreign terrorist organization, based instead on domestic extremism, then that's domestic terrorism. So one thing I want to just ask any of the folks up here with me, if you have other ways you look at it, other ways you define it, and how does it differ from a hate crime? And Oren, let me kick it off with you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I should start off by saying I'm not a lawyer. Hold your applause, okay? Listen, I think I'm going to leave the definitions to Tom and others, but I think what's important is how we're defining our collection of extremist violence in this country. And one of the things that ADL is doing is we've been tracking extremist-related murders throughout the United States for several decades. And here are just some basic data that I think will help inform the conversation throughout this summit for the next couple days. Over the last 10 years, when you look at all extremist-related murders, right-wing extremists have been responsible for 74%. Those who are motivated by ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been responsible for about 24%. And then there's the other, which is about 2%. So we have to start with just basic facts because they still matter. 74% of extremist-related murders have been carried out by right-wing extremists. Of those, the majority, so 54% of all these killings have been carried out by white supremacists in particular, right? Right-wing extremists, there are different kinds. And I think really briefly, I think it's important to understand how we're defining this, right? So there are ideologically motivated extremist-related murders and non-ideologically motivated. What I mean by that is, let's take some examples. When you have a member of the white supremacist group Atomwaffen, which has been involved in multiple killings throughout the country over the last couple of years, that's somebody who's a member and who targeted somebody because they're Jewish or because they're African American. That's an ideologically motivated extremist-related murder. That is in our data set. When somebody like the Pittsburgh shooter or Dylan Roof is not actually affiliated with an actual hate group, but is motivated by that ideology, we include that in our data as well. And here's something a lot of people may not realize. Most extremists in this country are unaffiliated with any group. So when we're talking about domestic terror statutes and designating terrorist organizations, I would just like to throw in a quick plug and say, if we're trying to create a domestic terror list, it's probably not going to be practical because most extremists are not affiliated with any other group. And then real quick, there's non-ideological extremist-related murders that we also include. So for example, when the Parkland shooting happened, here's an individual, and this might be controversial. Here's an individual who was active on Instagram, anti-Semitic, racist. He was talking about his opposition to interracial couples, especially women who get engaged in interracial couples, and then carried out a shooting and was known to have swastikas on his backpack. Now, I am not suggesting that he targeted those students because of his white supremacist ideology. But where white supremacists exist, violence is never far behind. And everybody within the orbit of these extremist movements tend to engage in violence as well. So here's somebody who would be included in our list. And if this is debatable, we're open for that debate. We have all this data on our heat map, which has 5,000 incidents located on the map, which we provide for anybody to download. So if you want to, you miss somebody or you want to add somebody, we stand by our data. We encourage you to include that. Last comment, there was a shooting in Kentucky. 2 African Americans are killed by an individual who apparently tried to get into a church and it was locked. He wasn't able to get in and said, white people don't shoot white people. There is no indication, as horrific as that is, likely a hate crime, that this person was affiliated with an extremist group, nor currently at least, though his online footprint showed that he was engaging or amplifying narratives that are common amongst extremists. So that case, while we need to talk about that in terms of the current environment of hate and violence, may not necessarily become part of that data. So I hope that helps explain just some of the nuances to how we're collecting that data.
Thank you, Oren. And to that point, just to sort of be clear about being parts of an organization or a group, as I talked about international terrorism, the way it's defined in our US criminal statutes, it tends to be terrorism. There are various statutes, I'm not going to get into all of them, but the most commonly used criminal statute is material support to a foreign terrorist organization. And so there, this membership in an organization and the desire to further the goals of that organization through money, through oneself as a fighter, through other types of support, that is illegal. In the United States, we do not designate, the federal government does not designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations. And partly it would be difficult, but partly there's some real First Amendment concerns there because you have foreign terrorist organizations don't have First Amendment rights. Organizations in the United States have a right to association, they have a right to freedom of expression, and you would really have to be able to show that the organization existed pretty much solely to commit terrorist violent acts, I think, to designate it without running afoul of the First Amendment. We could get into that debate maybe at tomorrow's session if people are interested. But so the fact that there aren't terrorist organizations and a lot of these domestic attacks are done by people sometimes call them lone wolves, people who aren't affiliated with an organization, doesn't necessarily mean it's not a terrorist event, a terrorist crime. Because if done with these intents, these ideological motives, and the intent to intimidate or coerce. In other words, I'm not just attacking you because I don't like you and I have a beef with you. I'm intending to send a message, and I'm sorry to single you out, to everyone else, not just in this room, but in this city, in this state, in this country, maybe even in the world. And that's what, we're going to call it if it's a crime of terrorism, let's call it terrorism. And that's partly what this discussion is about. But one question that does come up oftentimes is, well, how is that different from a hate crime? And Tom, I know you've looked a little bit at this. How is, and I don't mean necessarily because we don't have a crime of domestic terrorism, but what's the difference between hate crimes and domestic terrorism?
Sure, absolutely. First, probably before I get started, I have to make it clear that as the representative of the federal government, our approach is going to necessarily be somewhat different from other advocacy organizations like the ADL and others that work in this area. So that being said, the disclaimer, setting that aside, hate crimes and domestic terrorism, this comes up all the time. And the best way to frame this and to get folks to understand the dynamics here is to consider an actual case. And many of you may remember the case a couple years ago that was mentioned earlier. Dylan Roof murdered 9 parishioners in a African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Mr. Roof targeted those individuals because they were African-American. But he also perpetrated his attack with a view towards fomenting a race war. This was made abundantly clear in a manifesto that he penned, as well as in post-arrest statements to the police. So here we have a situation where an individual targets a particular group of individuals because of their race. Moreover, the individual targeted them with a view towards, again, coercing or intimidating a broader civilian population. And that's kind of under the rubric of fomenting a race war. So what do you make? What does one make of this? Well, Mr. Roof ultimately was charged, as many of you likely are aware, with multiple federal hate crimes violations as well as some federal weapons violations. All right, and here's where I don't want to get too legal and wonky on you, but I'm gonna go down that road here a little bit. Because I think there's some value in distinguishing some of these terms that are typically deployed in these settings and ensuring that we all understand precisely what they mean. So when we say hate crimes, we, in the federal government anyway, are referring exclusively to a suite of statutes, principally, sorry to do this to you guys, but 18 U.S.C. 241 through 18 U.S.C. 249, all right? And this is important because for a number of reasons, and that I'll touch on quickly, because I don't want to take up too much time of the panel. But so this is important for a number of reasons. The first is when an individual is charged with, say, for example, 18 U.S.C. 249, the title of that provision in our criminal code, which is Title 18, is, what do you think? This is supposed to be interactive, right?
Yes, interactive.
Okay, all right. What do you think it says on the top of the heading? Hate crime, absolutely, yes. What does it not say? Terrorism, okay? So this is important because when when the federal government brings a hate crimes charge against someone like Mr. Roof, the narrative, the prevailing narrative instantaneously becomes what? Hate. Is it hate? Absolutely, without a doubt. But what about the terrorism narrative? What happens to that? It falls out. It falls out entirely because the oxygen is sucked out of the ground by the hate. And I'm not saying it's not hate. It absolutely is. The guy committed a hate crime, and he was prosecuted for a hate crime. He was convicted of a hate crime. He got the death penalty for a hate crime, right? But he's also a terrorist. And there's a utility in recognizing that and consistently recognizing that. And we in the federal government are making efforts and strides to do a better job at that. I will point out any number of public remarks by senior officials in the Department of Justice that have retrospectively characterized Mr. Roof's action as nothing less than domestic terrorism. But in the heat of the moment, the terrorism piece tends to sort of fall away, right? Because on the face of the indictment, on the face of the criminal complaint, whatever it might be, hate features prominently. And what this does is it feeds this pervasive yet incorrect narrative that somehow the federal government is paying less attention to domestic terrorism. Maybe doesn't care quite as much about domestic terrorists as the international terrorists. But the real fact of the matter is, and Mary can speak to this far far more than I can. When you arrest somebody, like a 19-year-old kid that's trying to travel to Syria, on a federal material support to a foreign terrorist organization charge, what do you think is going to be on the face of the indictment, the public face of the indictment that enterprising young reporters are going to read and get to print the next day? What word is going to be on there? Foreign terrorist organization. Boom, we got a terrorism case, right?
And he's labeled a terrorist.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Whereas the same is not true for Mr. Roof. Or, and even to complicate matters further, perhaps there may be an individual, there are any number of cases along these lines, where an individual wants to, say, perhaps purchase a handgun from an undercover agent. So the FBI's on them, they want to purchase a weapon. The individual in question is a prohibited person, meaning they're not supposed to have a handgun. It's against the law, but they want to buy one real bad. And they tell the FBI undercover guy, hey, I want to buy this because I want to go murder a bunch of people. I want to go murder a bunch of black people because it's the righteous thing to do, and it's my time to stand up for the white race. All right? And the FBI does a buy, bust, sting. I'm using a little jargon here, I apologize, but and they indict him on a federal gun offense. Routine pedestrian federal gun offense happens all over the country every day. What word is not in that indictment? Terrorism. What word is? This guy's a felon and he bought a gun. Fini. Done. But is that a terrorism case? But for that disruption, that guy could have murdered any number of people in order to, animated by his ideology of hate, to be sure, but that's terrorism as well. And so you see how complicated it is for the federal government to get our hands around how many domestic terrorism cases we may be having at any particular point. Because in the main, domestic terrorism cases typically resolve with fairly pedestrian federal offenses like gun charges or explosive charges. Or, and I'm not saying it's pedestrian in a bad way, but criminal civil rights charges, like in the case of Mr. Roof. But that does not mean that we're not doing everything that we can to aggressively investigate and prosecute folks who are doing this kind of criminal activity. So hopefully that gives you a quick
I
snapshot.
want to come back to that. Yes, thank you for
Can I
that.
just say that,
Yeah,
in our
yeah.
reports on these issues, we call them terrorism. We have 25 years of terrorism that looks at all these cases, whether or not they were charged with hate crime, ultimately, whatever was on the top. This is where I think civil society is important to help define the conversation as these things happen. So.
And we've just seen an example, in fact, with Robert Bowers, the shooter at the Tree of Life, because the federal government came out with an indictment within about a week, and he's charged with 44 counts. But guess what they don't say? Terrorism. They are hate crimes. They are obstruction of freedom to practice religion. And that's clearly what they were, but they were also terrorism.
Yeah, and Mary, just real quick.
Yeah.
On that score, obviously I'm constrained from commenting on any
Any
cases
case.
that are presently being litigated, so I'll just leave it at that.
To tee up, because I want to talk to William here because he was on the ground in Pittsburgh. But Oren, to tee that up, you gave us some facts and figures that are very important, but what have you seen trend-wise in the last 2 years, 5 years, decade in terms of the numbers of domestic terrorist incidents?
So, I mean, again, the last 10 years, again, 74%. I mean, every year when you look at extremist-related murders, right-wing extremism and white supremacy in particular tends to be the cause for the deadliest attacks collectively. There was one year that was not true, the year of the Pulse nightclub shooting where 49 people were killed, and so that was the outlier. In terms of terrorist plots, we've also tracked both Islamist extremist plots and white supremacist, sovereign citizen plots. Those plots tend to be a little bit more even in numbers. But interestingly, when you look at, say, 98 Islamist extremist plots, and I think it's 97 plots by white supremacists and other right-wing extremists, the number of people involved with the Islamist extremist plots has been less. So 98 incidents, but less people involved, which suggests this sort of lone wolf concept, which I think is becoming more and more of sort of a myth. And so the reality is we don't have a luxury to ignore any threat in this country. It's coming from all sides. And another, piece of data that we track is anti-Semitic incidents in this country. And in the last 10, we've been doing it since 1979. The last year that we've put out data for 2017, we saw a 57% increase in anti-Semitic incidents from the previous year. In that previous year, there was a 34% increase. Now, that 57% increase was the greatest increase we've seen since we've been collecting this data. This year, we're continuing to see incidents as well. And I just want to say that collecting that data of anti-Semitism and terrorist plots and extremist murders are important when you put them on this heat map that I talk about. And one of the things that I hope we get out of this conversation is that if anybody here has data or access to data that you would like to visualize with these other important points of hate and extremism, we welcome that. The more data we have to put on a map, the more a mayor, a governor, more people in the community know what's actually happening and can create plans to respond.
That's actually the perfect segue to William, because I want to know, and I think people here want to know, you've mentioned just in our personal conversations that there was a lot of planning that the synagogue had already undertaken in advance of that attack. They, of course, didn't know that attack was going to happen, but to prepare for this. And what would prompt, except maybe the data Oren's just told us about, what would prompt that kind of preparation?
So thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to my ADL colleagues as well. And Jonathan was also on the ground in Pittsburgh, and I'm sure can share his experiences as well. Just thinking about Pittsburgh, there were all sorts of low marks and punctuated by some high water marks. I was there in the immediate aftermath of the shooting the next day, and just to give a sense, and I'm sure some of you have been through these sort of crises, it was, so I don't know how many of you are Harry Potter fans, but J.K. Rowling, when she describes the Dementors, right, which are those sort of black ghost-like figures that guard the prison and sort of take over. There's the famous scene with Harry in the train car. She describes that as being what waves of depression were like for her. This like wave of black, and she was just sort of soulless. And that's what it felt like being in Pittsburgh. There was just this wave of darkness over the entire community, a Jewish community and non-Jewish community. Our Federation CEO, Jeff Finkelstein, said that in his 20 years of being in Pittsburgh, he never hugged as many people as he'd hugged that week. And I can attest that from Starbucks baristas to cops on the corner, everybody was mourning together. And there was this great darkness. But punctuated by the darkness were some really amazing moments. The law enforcement was front and center in ensuring that the community felt safe. If you think about it, there were 11 high-profile funerals right there that week with the same sort of security concerns. And the police, the local police there, were incredibly helpful, as were the federal law enforcement. The sports teams, I'm sure you may recall, the Penguins put a patch on their team jerseys. The football team did events helping out. The newspaper on the Friday after the attacks, 6 days later, on its front page, published in Hebrew or Aramaic, the Kaddish, which is our mourner's prayer, our Jewish mourner's prayer. And all of this, to get to your question, is focused on the relationships that the Jewish community had before the attack. The fact that on the Friday before the attack, we had relationships as a community with law enforcement, with the news media, with the sort of general community, so that on the Saturday of the attack, we weren't introducing ourselves for the first time to the political and governmental and law enforcement officials, that those relationships were there, that there didn't have to be that sort of awkward dance that you can't do in a crisis situation. Just being here with the mayor of Pittsburgh was at all 11 funerals. He was omnipresent there on behalf of the community. And if you think about just how the community was lost, just sort of in a daze, and to have the political infrastructure of the community, as well as the law enforcement and the civic society, standing up with us as a Jewish community, holding hands and being there, was incredibly impactful for the morale of the community and to help them move forward. The interreligious, the interfaith, and I know there's representation in this room of many of our cousins in the faith community. The interfaith relationships were and are a key focal point. On the day after the shooting, there was an interfaith session where there were imams and priests and Hindu and Buddhist faith leaders and pastors and rabbis, obviously, across the board. And those are relationships that the Pittsburgh Jewish community has worked on for decades. African-American community as well, where we, the Pittsburgh Jewish community and the African-American community in Pittsburgh have worked for decades on civil rights issues and other issues of social justice. And the black community came out front and center, the African-American churches, in support of our community. And so I guess the bottom line is that the more that we're able to cultivate these relationships in advance, to work together on projects, to work together as communities when we're not in a crisis modality, it makes it so that, God forbid, when those occasions occur, we're just able to move forward, and that resilience showed itself in Pittsburgh.
William. Tom, I promised we'd get back to this, and I know a lot of people in this room do want to know. I know it's very common. Reporters call me, others call me regularly and say, why doesn't the federal government do anything about domestic terrorism? When I was the acting assistant attorney general for national security, I met with representatives of Muslim advocacy organizations on numerous occasions who expressed always concern that their communities were targets of law enforcement investigations, international terrorism investigations, and they want to be good partners with law enforcement in making sure that terrorism cases get prosecuted, but they also feel very uncomfortable, and I understand that as much as I can, not being Muslim myself, not really having walked a mile in their shoes, but I understand the concern of feeling like so much is targeted at your community, the Islamic community, and not at the white supremacist community, for example. And so I do think that's a very, very valid concern. There are efforts, and part of it is, frankly, and we'll move on to this in a minute, but part of it is there is not a domestic terrorism offense, and so that affects how resources are allocated. It reflects budget, it reflects data collection, et cetera. But it's also not true that there is no emphasis put on it. And Tom, enlighten us a little bit about the efforts of the federal government in this area.
Well, it's not only the federal government, ma'am. It's also state and local governments.
Yes,
they do a tremendous amount in combating domestic terrorism, as we in the federal government understand it. And again, as Mary alluded to, we hew strictly to the statutory definition under Title 18 that defines domestic terrorism, as Mary noted. And that's our North Star, if you will. Obviously, others that deal in this area may have slightly differing definitions. And that's fine, but for our purposes, we hew to the definition that you'll find in the criminal code for obvious reasons. It just makes a lot of sense. So one of the misconceptions I think that persists time and time again is this notion that domestic terrorism takes second fiddle to international terrorism in terms of the collective efforts of the federal government in getting and in combating it. The fact of the matter is, there have been a substantial number of cases that have been brought and successfully prosecuted in which domestic terrorists have targeted Muslim American communities. They have targeted Jewish American communities. And I'm not talking about historically, I'm talking about in the past 3 years, none of which tend to draw a lot of media attention for some of the reasons that I've already outlined to you earlier. There have been cases in which individuals have plotted to firebomb and murder Islamic communities in upstate New York. There have been cases in which individuals have plotted to firebomb and murder Somali Americans in Kansas. There have been any number of cases in which individuals have persistently threatened Islamic community centers, Jewish community centers, media outlets, et cetera, on and on and on. And those typically concern, again, rather pedestrian threat statutes that do not certainly contain the word terrorism on their face. And so as a consequence, the terrorism narrative tends not to be underscored when these cases hit the press. And as a consequence, they are largely framed in other terms. and again, by folks that study in this area, aren't included, of course, you guys are great, but other academics, the media in many instances, maybe it's going to be a lone gunman, a disgruntled employee, whatever the term might be. But the fact of the matter is, if an individual commits violence in the service of an ideology and is otherwise unconnected to a foreign terrorist organization or a foreign power, that individual is a domestic terrorist. That's the long and short of it.
So do you think any of that, I know you indicated that some government leaders have started to use the label, but I think it is a relatively new thing. And do you think that that would make more of a difference if people in government started, forget whether there's a statute or not that makes it a crime, but just started calling people domestic terrorists when that's what they...
I think that there's a lot of value in that, ma'am. Yes, and I think that you have, I'm cautiously optimistic that we are trending in that direction. I would highlight former Attorney General Sessions' remarks in the immediate aftermath of Charlottesville, where he came on the record in public and characterized that attack as domestic terrorism right out of the gate. So that's in some ways, a signal departure from some of the statements that we'd seen from the department in earlier days. So again, I'm certainly optimistic that folks are becoming more comfortable in deploying that term when circumstances permit. But again, I need to take a second here and ensure, ma'am, I'm sure you fully appreciate this, that the specific determination about what to charge in a particular case is going to be governed by the facts and circumstances of that case. And you have to understand that at the end of the day, federal prosecutors are geared towards bringing charges that will result in convictions. And anything that is going to jeopardize that determination, or in their view, jeopardize that effort, they are going to cast aside, or they are going to be reluctant to engage in. I'm not suggesting that characterizing something out of the gate as domestic terrorism would jeopardize a federal prosecution, but it merits saying that first and foremost, the role of the department is to bring charges that will result in successful prosecution, full stop.
And I think another point worth mentioning, Tom has mentioned various other federal criminal statutes that can be used oftentimes when the crime is really one of terrorism that don't have the terrorism label. But to be clear, also, if it's a murder is illegal in all 50 states under state law, right? There are adequate crimes to prosecute these offenses. It's a murder, it's a kidnapping, it's a rape, it's an assault with a dangerous weapon, etc. It's not like no crimes exist. There's just not a crime called domestic terrorism at the federal level. And so one thing that I'm just going to put my cards out there, I have advocated and will continue to advocate for the enactment of a federal crime of domestic terrorism. Not one that designates domestic terrorist groups for some of the reasons I alluded to earlier, but one that basically makes the crime, if it is a crime of violence, harmful to life, which is done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or to influence policy of government through intimidation or coercion, that itself could be a federal crime. It would have that label on it, it would be domestic terrorism, and what I want to pose to this group is, in doing that, a couple of things happen. One, we put it on the same moral equivalent plane as Islamic extremistic terrorism. There is not one terrorist that is worse than another. Well, there are some terrorists that are worse than other terrorists, but terrorism is bad. They're all bad, right? They're all bad. There's not good people on both sides of terrorism. Not to get political, but I'm not in government anymore, so I'm sort of like ungagged. Sorry, Tom.
It's fun watching you be gagged, though, Tom.
Yeah.
It's fun being gagged.
But I think there might be some other benefits that it would have too. When it comes to resources, and again, I know that the federal government does go after these things, but do you think there would be value in terms of data collection and distribution of government investigatory resources if there is that crime labeled there?
Regrettably, ma'am, I'm gonna have to kind of punt on a little bit on that, but what I can say, and the reason being is I'm not really in a position to advocate publicly for a piece of legislation. That being said, how I typically respond when this question is posed, which it is all the time, as you might imagine, is to, frankly, ma'am, point to your piece in Lawfare. By the way, it's Lawfare blog. Please check it out. You do a fantastic job of laying out the case for a domestic terrorism statute. That being said, there are equally, there are some fantastic pieces by ACLU and Fordham University that take the opposite tact. So that sort of lays out the framework of the arguments pro and con, and I would invite you to consider it and draw your own conclusions from that. One thing that I would note on the DT statute is that, again, the way the legal landscape is set up with regard to domestic terrorism, whereas it may be useful, it may not. Again, I can't advocate one way or another. It wouldn't necessarily be a panacea in the sense that we're still going to. And this kind of goes back to what I said about the particular facts and circumstances of a given case. There are going to be situations where even if you have a DT statute, you're still going to bring a criminal civil rights charge in connection with a particular case. You're still going to bring that gun charge, right? And again, that's the determination of the U.S. attorney usually in a given district based on the facts and circumstances presented to him or her at a given time. And it's a roundabout way of saying we're going to use every tool that we have available in order to aggressively investigate and prosecute domestic terrorism wherever we find it. Could we use another tool? That's for others to decide. But suffice it to say, those tools will be leveraged as aggressively as we possibly can.
I think, we've sort of covered this territory, but what we haven't really covered adequately yet, which I want to spend the rest of our time in, is, all right, so now we're talking about what do we do after the fact, after a terrorism incident. Let's rewind the tape to before the terrorist incident. What do we know, William and Oren, what tools can we use to try to prevent these incidents? Now, I can tell you about my experience looking at a lot of data sets and a lot of case examples of international terrorism where I see incredible parallels between those who become, go down the road, the path toward radicalization to violence, motivated by foreign terrorist organizations, and those who go down the path of radicalization to violence motivated by domestic causes such as white supremacy. Oftentimes, we have individuals who are disaffected. They are having trouble finding sort of their place in society. They are looking for something greater than themselves, something to belong to. Even if it's not literally belonging to an organization, but you can have it. You can virtually belong now, just on your electronic devices, and suddenly you don't have to go meet at the community center or at the basketball court or wherever. You can just suddenly have all these people online. And so what can we learn from international terrorism or not from that? What can we just learn? How do we nip this in the bud before that person goes down that path?
So I'll let Oren talk at 10,000 feet. I'll try to talk at ground level. And you alluded this in your question to me. 2 weeks before the shooting in Pittsburgh, that synagogue had active shooter training. This is the sort of training that ADL encourages, that our Jewish Federation affiliate SCAN, Secure Community Network, encourages, where people know ahead of time what to think about, to have situational awareness, to know about the exits that are here, to have a sense for what floor we're on, to look at people's faces. The key point with the active shooter training in Pittsburgh was that they convinced the rabbi to carry a phone with him on Shabbat. So on the Jewish Sabbath, people who are Orthodox, more observant, don't use electronics, they don't watch TV, they don't use phones. They convinced him to carry a phone with him just in case there was a need, because no one else in the synagogue would have a phone that was on and ready. And because he had that phone, he was able to dial 911 within the first 45 seconds of the attack, which is why the police were there within minutes as well, the police station 2.5 blocks away. That sort of active shooter training, sort of on the ground, having recognition of what we can do to save lives. I'm sure, maybe, that having the domestic terrorism statute on the books will save some lives. I know for certain that this active shooter training, the type of training that ADL and SCAN and the rest of us encourage folks to have, did save lives a couple weeks ago.
Let's rewind even further back than that, or into before we even are doing active shooter.
How do we stop radicalization, recruitment, violence, and hate in 140 characters or less?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's about intelligence and an apparatus to get the intelligence to the people who need it most, right? So we know that these social media platforms exist at like modern day digital hate groups. You said you don't have to, see somebody, you don't have to meet them at a bar, sign membership dues and become a member of the group. These social networks, pair you up with like-minded sympathizers who are trying to motivate you, who are giving you the propaganda, who are telling you what to target and giving you the community support to make it think that you're normal, that your ideas are okay. That's the definition of a hate group, and just in digital form. So Jonathan mentioned earlier opening up an office in Silicon Valley and holding these companies not only accountable to stop the exploitation of their services, but to work with these companies from within to better enforce their terms of services and, frankly, teach them what extremism is. They have the algorithms, they have the technology. You know what we have? The expertise. What does it sound like when anti-Semites or anti-Muslim bigots or misogynists talk to each other? What does it look like when memes are shared between white supremacists? Can we provide that to these companies so they can teach their machines to be preemptive in trying to stop them from spreading, right? I mean, that's one way. But more importantly, when we're collecting this information, and frankly, it's a challenge, because the shooter in Pittsburgh, we looked at his Gab profile. It was wholly unremarkable. There are thousands of others like it, and there was nothing about that profile, as disgusting as it is, we see this stuff all the time, that would have made us know that this is going to be somebody who's going to go over. So, but we need to be able to provide, as we do, information to law enforcement in a way that they can then make sure that they're leveraging it and protecting their communities. I think this is difficult because when somebody robs your house, you call the local police, they're going to make an arrest, hopefully. When somebody is harassing you online, you call the local police, they may not even know where this person came from. So we have to retrain ourselves on how we're training law enforcement. And last point on this, we talk about, is domestic terrorism being taken as seriously by the way that we're defining it? And I would say this, we've been training law enforcement at ADL for 15 years. The most popular trainings that have been requested from ADL, from federal, state, and local law enforcement has been about anti-government extremists and white supremacists for 15 years. So perhaps that means they weren't getting it from somewhere else, or perhaps that means they've always known what a significant threat this has been. So the partnerships there are real.
One other last comment I'll make on this is one thing that we saw in data about international extremism, having actually relied on FBI data, doing a retrospective of lots of previous cases, is that in, I think it was 70% of the cases, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody in the orbit of that person, a parent, a coach, a teacher, a friend, a coworker, did think something was up with the person who ended up committing the terrorist-related crime, and almost always didn't say anything. And I also understand that, because it's pretty hard. What are you going to call up your local police and say, I think my brother is a terrorist? That's a really hard thing to do. But it's also really hard to think about what happens if you don't, and that person does take human lives. So again, I think this is about, and this is what the next day is going to be made of, talking about, like, how do we bring communities together where people have enough trust in each other and in law enforcement to share this information, try to get people help, try to reach out to them, try to find other outlets and other ways they can feel like they belong that maybe will take them off that path of radicalization to violence and on the path of being productive members of their communities. I will be hanging around. I really would have loved to have taken questions, but I'm being told that we're finished. So please, many people in the room I've maybe met over email or on phone calls, but not in person. I would love to talk to everybody here at various times over the next day, whether it's tonight on domestic terrorism, on other things. Please, let's make this a really great, community gathering. Thank you.
Thank you.